Afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for this year's CRPP Talks. My name is Nisha Krishnan, and I am the Program Manager for the Community Resilience and Partnership Program at the Asian Development Bank. For those of you who are new to CRPP, the CRPP is a regional partnership program hosted at the ADB, aimed at supporting our developing member countries in the Asia-Pacific region to scale up investments in climate adaptation at the local level, especially those investments that address the nexus of climate change, poverty, and gender. The CRPP aims to strengthen local and national systems like those of social protection, decentralization, agriculture, and food systems to be more climate resilient, such that we can actually reach scale in local level investments, and that we can actually unlock the flow of climate finance to meet the priorities of local communities. The CRPP also aims to ensure that while strengthening these systems, we build long-lasting partnerships with local communities, especially grassroots women's groups. This is actually our third CRPP Talks, which is a webinar series where we try to highlight knowledge on emerging issues, innovations, good practice, and lessons on designing and implementing adaptation projects that build local resilience. Our first two climate talks were actually from our CRPP Talks were last year, based on examples from the World Bank and the UN Capital Development Fund. And we're just pasting the links to those CRPP Talks if you'd like to catch up into the chat. Before we get started and go on to the main show, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. First, we really hope that you are in listening mode, and so please do mute your microphone if you're not talking. You may turn on your video, especially once we get to the Q&A section. Please do set your name in Zoom so that we can identify and call on you when you do have a question, and please do use the chat function as well as the Q&A function if a question arises during the presentation, and we'll definitely get to this towards the second half of this discussion today. Now onto the main part of the show. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Veronica Doerr, who is the Climate Advisor at the Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research, where she's been leading efforts to scale deep and scale out the climate considerations in ACIAR's investments. She's joining us today from Australia, so over to you, Veronica. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Nisha, and thanks to all of you for joining. I'm really excited to hopefully have a really good discussion today. And to kick that off, I'm trying to share some of what we're trying to do here at ACIAR and through Australian researchers in climate, and really looking forward to what you think of it all. So Karen, if you could advance to the next slide. The first thing I just want to mention is most people don't think of Australia immediately when you think of a global powerhouse in achieving action on climate. And that's unfortunate, because in fact, Australia was one of the first countries to start doing real action research, particularly around locally led adaptation. So I know we don't often showcase it on the international stage, but we got really quite serious around 2007. And it was predominantly because local governments and rural communities were facing really immediate problems with coastal erosion and things like drought and bushfire risk. There was formal recognition in 2012 by all governments across Australia that an appropriate scale for decision-making really was the local scale. So they came to an agreement about what different levels of government, what responsibilities they had when it came particularly to climate adaptation. And that agreement wasn't necessarily because there was a big push around climate justice, which is often one of the reasons why we support locally led adaptation in international development. But it was a very practical reason in a sense. It was the recognition that there's significant local variation in the impacts experienced, and that requires locally differentiated responses. We began to really mainstream locally led adaptation without necessarily using that terminology, particularly in coastal planning and in regional natural resource management. So that phrase to us means the kind of integration of agriculture and biodiversity in rural landscapes. And many of the researchers involved in informing and shaping this, particularly through participatory action research, also worked in international development. So there was lots of cross-fertilization of lessons learned from working in a global north country and working in a number of global south or low and middle income countries. And that's particularly through Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Ethiopia, Vietnam, and the Solomon Islands. So hopefully that gives you a sense of why maybe Australia does have something to say about locally led adaptation. Next slide, please. So I've had the great opportunity to be trying to drive locally led adaptation through the climate change program of the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. I know that's a big mouthful, but we just call it ACIAR. So in many ways, ACIAR is really primed to be an organization to drive LLA because we have this really strong partnership and delivery model. So we take a percentage of Australia's overseas development assistance funds each year, and we invest them deliberately in research for development that's intended to benefit small-scale food producers and small businesses involved in agriculture and rural livelihoods. And our approach has always been about setting up these collaborative partnerships between Australian researchers and in-country researchers, as well as NGOs and governments, and doing really grounded work with farmers to understand what it is they want and need and how they can directly benefit. So it really has a kind of locally led philosophy behind it. And as we move more into climate and climate adaptation, we're really primed to take on LLA. So a dedicated climate change program was started in 2020. And for about 3.5 years, from 2020 to 2023, I had the privilege of being the person to build it. So it was my job to design and contract a series of these partnership investments to collectively advance the science and the practice of systems transformation to respond to climate change. And of course, one of those systems changes that's often talked about that we need is shifting the power to local people for decision making. So locally led adaptation is an inherent part of that systems transformation. Part of the reason ACIAR has a partnership model is to leverage what Australian experience and expertise can contribute in partnership with our partners in low and middle income countries. So the focus of the program's investments has been very much about how can Australia add value. And I do that through, I've now got sets of projects that work in 8 very specific problem or opportunity contexts around the world. And when you receive the slides after this, there'll be a slide at the bottom that shows you the 8 different contexts. And in particular, what I'm trying to advance is some of the science around adaptation pathways, which is something that Australian researchers have had a big voice in globally. And it recognizes that adaptation really is an ongoing decision-making process. It's not about a single technical solution. It's not even about a single social intervention, because climate change, unfortunately, continues. It's a trajectory. And so we need those ongoing adaptive decision-making processes. What we've also learned through that history of LLA type work in and outside Australia is that implementing any step change in those ongoing decision-making processes still requires multiple systems actors to be aligned, right? So no one farmer can, completely make the changes they might need to on their farm, not even a single local government or single community. So locally led work needs to be regionally supported, nationally enabled, and that involves both government and private sector type partners. So those are some of the things that we've learned. And what I was asked to talk about today is how we're thinking about the issue of scaling. And because we're just at the stage where, we've collaboratively built these partnerships, we've built these proposals, we've been moving through into contracting, there is a good reflection point now to say, what have we already learned from the way all of these different projects with different partnerships have ended up being designed? What are some commonalities that tell us something about the way Australian researchers and researchers across the Asia Pacific are thinking about scaling when it comes to building locally led action? So what I've done today is done my own kind of reflection on where collectively all of these projects that I'm resourcing have been putting effort into scaling. And it looks very conceptual at first, but then I'll give you one or two examples if we have time to really help you see exactly what I'm talking about in a more granular, grounded sort of way. And then really a few kind of conclusions, and we'll open it up for discussion. So next slide, please. So here's what's emerged collectively from these investments so far about scaling. So normally, and particularly in Australia, we started with this thinking about planning, that adaptation was about planning and then implementation, hence my little spirally line here. Next slide. And certainly that planning process is important, but when we think about adaptation specifically being a process of decision-making, then the first thing that my projects really are focusing on is what we call scaling deep, which allows you to think about not just doing something lightly in one place, but really embedding it, making sure that it's institutionally embedded, that you've got not just the kind of trial of a process for decision making, but that you've built that into a formalized tool, a process that someone else can pick up. So then next slide, from that scaling deep, we then think about scaling out. So how can those processes for local people to be able to think through and make all their own decisions using whatever inputs are available, how can those processes then be scaled out? How can many different communities be supported to make those same types of decisions? And usually we're trying to do that through multiple different actors within the local political economy, because you're never quite sure who's really going to take it up, and trying to consider things like institutional sustainability so that you're setting in place something that's going to continue long after your own funding is done. Next slide. Only then do we tend to think about scaling up, which is about going into policy and formal rules in a government or in a society. And we focus the scaling up on the people or the institutions who essentially govern those actors who are scaling out. So the purpose of up is to enable out. But what we certainly know is if you treat the planning, if you do all of that in terms of like an adaptation planning and an initial decision-making sort of process, and then you start thinking about implementation, next slide, that's exactly where things tend to break down. And that's sort of what happened in the early years in Australia. So you do all this planning work, and then people start to try to implement and recognize that there are all these barriers to individual agency to act. So most of my projects are trying to get around that kind of falling into that horrible gap of implementation barriers by thinking not about necessarily the same kind of implementation that everyone used to, but about what I'm going to call systematizing. So next slide, please. So at the same time that we're trying to figure out how you scale deep, often in a kind of case study sort of sense, and I'll get to that in a minute, scale deep those processes for people to make locally relevant contextualized decisions, you're also at the same time trying to scale deep a demonstration of viable systems change. So, a farming community decides on a direction they need to go in, but it requires a different set of inputs. It requires the provision of microfinance, whatever those other things it requires, we're then trying to build at the same time as we're doing the decision-making processes, so that you've got a local scale demonstration of what kind of systems change kind of could look like. And then next slide. After the scaling deep, we then think about scaling out. So once you learn enough about what those system supports look like, they might be relatively common across different local communities. So a farming group here might have one approach they want to take, and a farming group here has another approach because they're facing different conditions, but they both maybe need the same general form of microfinance, or, you know, the ability to rely on social protections while they're transitioning or something like that. So we then think about how you scale out those common systems supports. And then next slide. And then again, the scaling up is in service of the scaling out. So what sort of higher order policies or finance models are there that really enable that scaling out of those common system supports? So as I said, this was going to be very conceptual. So now I'd like to illustrate it. But first I need to make a quick comment about case studies. So when you seem to start with the scaling deep, it can look a lot like the typical case study thing. And we've had lots of case studies that seem to show success in LLA, but that's why we're talking about scaling. How do we get beyond those case studies? So next slide. So my observation is that the problem with traditional case studies is they tend to try to go straight from that scaling deep in a place, straight to like policies and finance models. And it's just, it's too much of a disconnect, because you have to actually build the evidence and the sense of the potential for success through progressing the scaling out first, at the very least. So that's, these extra elements, I think, are what make it very different from a traditional case study approach. So next slide. So I'd like to ground this for you and help, I hope, make it a little bit more real and a little bit more tangible. And so I'd like to talk about a project that I have actively going right now in two Pacific Island countries, in Kiribati and the Solomon Islands. And in each country, the project has its own local name. So in Kiribati, it's Waimeru, and in the Solomon Islands, it's Future Kai Kai. And this is a project that's co-led by James Butler, Alaric McCarthy, and Federico de Villa. And my wonderful scientists are really the sort of people I'm leaning on to give a talk like this today. And you'll find that the second to last slide has all of their contact details if you'd like to reach out to them. So the challenge that we're trying to address in these Pacific countries is that climate change is obviously dramatically impacting and going to continue to impact, particularly their coral reef-based and nearshore marine resources. So these are resources that people have traditionally relied upon as sources of protein. And in many Pacific Island countries, you have a very resource-constrained, land-based environment as well. So they're remote, they're islands, it's really expensive to get supplies there. And yet with the decline of marine resources, they're going to have to rely on land-based resources even more. And so we're trying to explore more circular food production and food systems options that help to make the most of the resources available to be able to intensify some land-based production. So that's the intent behind it, but the intent is broad. And of course, we're operating in a locally led way. So next slide. What this looks like is the scaling deep is about really developing formal codified processes for local community members to come together in ways that pay careful attention to gender and social equity, so that, you know, everyone has a voice, and really co-understand and co-negotiate what their futures might look like. And so there's a series of tools and processes that bring in some of the climate projections, but actually link them directly to things that people have already identified that they value in their food systems, that help them understand what trajectories are going to look like and think through what, appropriate and reasonable responses that they might like to trial would be. And so by codifying those processes into formal guides, formal training, it enables us to think about how to scale them out. So next slide. To scale out these processes in many Pacific Island countries, you've got quite a small total population size who have to still run all the functions of a national government. So you don't generally have government extension officers, right? You don't have the ability for government itself to do a lot of this scaling. And this is where Pacific Island countries often rely on NGOs, almost as like government extension agents. So we work directly with WWF Pacific and an NGO called Live and Learn, and they've got a long-term presence, a deep relationship with government. And so by building these tools for working with community that then WWF and Live and Learn could use again and again and again in their work, we have the chance to sort of scale out these processes. The team is also building a network of climate knowledge brokers. And that's a series of individuals who might work in these NGOs, but also be community members, and is developing the kind of training that allows these brokers to sustain these processes over time. Next slide. Scaling up then means really making sure we're doing all the right things to engage the CEOs of these NGOs so that they understand and we can discuss and we can make sure that, they're prepared to take on board these processes in other projects into the future. And then similarly, the broker network has an institutional home with the Pacific Climate Change Center, which is run by SPREP, the Secretariat for the Pacific Regional Environment Program. So represents environment and climate interests across all of its Pacific Island member countries. So has the ability to then spread that training of brokers and the tools and processes that they might use to work with communities across even a broader set of Pacific Island countries. Next slide. But critically, we don't do all that sequentially and then think about the scaling deep. Instead, the project is kind of doing the things in the green boxes just enough to help communities select the things they want to trial as a deep demonstration of systems change. And then we're doing all that at the same time in the project. So they may be selecting things associated with, growing seaweed as a more kind of farming type enterprise that then goes along with sea cucumber ranching, and then some of the waste products from that become fertilizer onto the fields. That's just one example of some of these circular options that are available, but the communities themselves are choosing which of these they want to try to trial, and then we work to build the extra system supports in that allow that to be a trial. Next slide. So scaling out those common supports. So the project has been working on these trial examples of these circular options, but then also talking through who would you need to make that really successful, and doing that with a range of other potential options that the communities are identifying. And then through all of that, you can start to see that there are some really common threads. So in Kiribati, you currently have a national government that is incredibly supportive of food systems change and are really ready to roll up their sleeves and do some things. So figuring out how to work with them is a really critical part of scaling out systems supports. In the Solomon Islands, they've had a lot of success with building up an industry around sea grapes. And so recognizing that strength, being able to build on that. So if we can think about building any sort of additional circular options that can rely on the same system supports that have already been put in place for the sea grapes, then we can build on those strengths and create a much more successful model. Next slide. And truthfully, we haven't yet deeply considered the scaling up of the scaling out of the system's supports. And that is something that usually needs to be worked out later once you figure out what the common system supports are. But I think the important thing here is that instead of doing one of these and then going to the next and then going to the next, there's a little bit of kind of doing it all at once, except maybe for this one bit of scaling up that will come later after we've got a number of the other bits of information and processes in place. All right, next slide. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to say that was one tangible example. And when you receive the slides, you'll see that I have another one as well from the polders in the southern coastal region of Bangladesh. But I think discussion is more important than hearing another example. So I will ask Karen if she can fast forward through the slides to get to probably the one I think that is key messages. There we go. So what I'm really hoping you have understood from the work that we've been doing with many different researchers across many different country contexts, but all kind of building on this history of learning from Australia, is we're focusing on the fact that it's the processes for decision-making that can scale and the systems supports that make it possible for people to implement those decisions. Those are the main things that we need to focus on scaling. We distinguish between scaling deep, out, and up. And it is important to scale deep first, because that's what gives you enough evidence and the tangible tools to then actually invoke the scaling out and up. And up is done to enable out. That all needs to be quite contextualized to national and provincial scale political economies. Who is able to take things out in a locally led kind of way, and how can research and advocacy to some degree enable that? It's really important to include that local systems change with multiple actors to be able to start implementing, not just do the cycle of planning and then implementing. And related to that, it's not strictly sequential. There's kind of one of the common things we're starting to talk about is the need to at least start and do a bit of everything, everywhere, all at once. Which sounds chaotic, but actually, if you planned it well from the beginning, I think it's achievable. The last thing, of course, is that we're all still learning how to do this. So I think it's really important to always be prepared for imperfection, and therefore you want to embed a plan to learn in everything that you do, so you can think about and adjust and reshape as you go. So I'm really interested in hearing whether this matches your thinking and experiences. What are we missing in our thinking and projects? What should we be considering? And what are the other sorts of things you guys have tried in your own practice of trying to not just implement locally led adaptation, but think about how we accelerate its ability to happen in lots of different places. That's it from me. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Veronica. That was really, I think, a different way of thinking through how we actually have more adaptive and flexible, I think, not just project delivery, but systems delivery, because we often are doing work planning first and then implementation second, as you were just talking about. And I actually wanted to invite a colleague at the Asian Development Bank, Michiko Katagami, who is our principal agriculture and natural resources specialist, and she's also part of the CRPP working group that we have internally at ADB. So Michiko, if I can hand over to you to kick us off in this discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Veronica. That was really, really interesting sort of conceptual discussion that we've been nowadays having day in, day out. We're thinking about this upscaling and adaptation in many countries. I represent today's I'm from the agriculture, forestry, and natural resources sector group. And then I think you might have heard that as all of us we're in a transition to become a climate bank more than anything else. So any of this aspect of this climate change has become just a normal corporate sort of agenda. But I mean, when you think about this, the food system and the agriculture sectors, it's just a critical factor that you have to take in for any of the investment. It's really binding risk that is imposed on the smallholder farmers that we are catered to serve for. So that conceptual discussion, we're very familiar with the concept, yet we haven't really thought out of in a sort of systemic manner like that. So that was really appreciated. I think that's one good contribution that your team is making. We often think about this in the context of the scaling needs. We have in our region, we have close to 400 million farmers who's just, most of them are very small. And we're in the business to convince them to take on this adaptation measure investment in kind or just that with assistance. And then that's in so doing, we always are thinking about how can we generate the incentive, but not only for the capacity to take on adaptation measure, but also there has to be a sort of it's a long journey of this transformation of the system. So there has to be some kind of business incentive that has to be nestled into that. I think that's something that has come towards your scaling up area that who's going to finance this, and it's kind of the business models. And then that it's good to take us through it about this, how you initiate with the community led. And we also follow the same principle in a sense. And I kind of like understand the desire to jump into the last portion of it that you mentioned as a traditional approach. And but it's we really have to think about the systemic way of this embedding into that sort of discussion, not just for the short period of time, but also, you thinking about this as scaling up the both sides. So I completely agree with that. I think one of the things maybe it's that there's something I was not really clear about is this. When you talked about this example of this Kiribati, I think it was Solomon, you're talking about this whole the maricultures, and also they say you wanted to do the circular system. And I can understand about this seaweed and also sea cucumber at the bottom, and some of the seaweed would turn into fertilizer and all that. Then what is this biosolid thing? And I think that in the context of the typical adaptation that to go for, that I didn't really understand what they're really doing and what you're really supposed to do. That's I'm really curious about this. Another thing that I just wanted to ask you about this, when you think about the structuring of these three different phrases, this that eventually you would have to involve so many institutions, not just the government or community, but it's other private sector, maybe financier to upscale. And we tend to think to reach to that within one sort of a project investment timeline. And in so doing, we always talk to potential business scheme development, and that informs a kind of feasible thing that we want to push for the adaptation. And then if there's certain critical adaptation that needs to take place, yet there's no obvious financier, then we have to just put the bucket into the government subsidy support or something, that schemes that we have to further discuss on this. We think that is very critical point of view that to discuss, not just for the discussion with these potential partners that's going to come in later stage in the private companies or financial institution, microfinance institutions, so forth. But when we talk to the community farmers, they will say, okay, so some of them that don't really face that sort of a drastic sort of a risk in the facing that in the daily life, they say, if I change this behavior, what do I get in terms of, the business? What more money do I make? That's always the typical question that we get. For example, I'm on the mission to the adaptation investment in Maldives right now. In the first instance, they asked, we went there on all this discussion with the community, stakeholders, government, island council, women groups, NGOs. It is listed of all this potential things that we should do, rank them and all the discussion. And at the end of the day, it's like, oh, Michiko, I'm not going to do anything if that doesn't really yield to the extra cash. they're very straightforward about this. So that necessitated us to talk to these value chain players up front and thinking about within the 5-6 years time frame, what sort of business plan we can lead to. And that has become the very big part of this agenda. So I'm really curious about your thinking about how do you structure partnerships down the road? You said it's going to be something to consider later on, but from our experiences, you would have to have them that are real, particularly in a place like Kiribati or Solomon Islands, where not all that potential investor could come in upfront, right? So that's something that I was curious about, and I would understand your experience about how you structure all this partnership going down the road. So that's my, anyway, in any case, it was very, very provocative, and it's really interesting discussion I bring into the table. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michiko. Veronica, did you want to take some of the questions that Michiko was asking in terms of, what does sustainability look like in this sense? How do we think about partnerships more holistically? But yes, over to you, please.
I'm happy to do that, and I'll do it fairly briefly so that people who are typing things into the chat, we can give them a chance, or people can speak up even, right? So one of the things I would clarify is, so in the Pacific Islands example, we're really careful. We're not trying to get people to do seaweed farming, sea cucumber farming, right? We're structuring a conversation that says, here are all the risks and threats that you're facing. We're coming to agreement around their knowledge and experience, what they integrate from the scientific knowledge that we're able to bring to the table, and then say, so given all of that, do we need to have more circular options? And here's what science says are some options. What do you think? And so we'll see. The biosolids refers to, so biodigesters are becoming increasingly common in Pacific Island countries, and the digestate can be separated into like a liquid fertilizer and a biosolid. So that's what that word's referring to. And absolutely agree with you. So the way you've expressed the need to think about those other private sector partners, investors, right, the other parts of the value chain, I think that's why we start that scaling deep type approach really early on, because thinking through who's going to be involved, what's that going to look like, has to be part of the iterative process of then communities themselves kind of going, oh, so that thing we really thought was going to be ideal, yeah, that's probably not going to work. We need to be thinking about this other sort of thing. But I think we take a lighter touch idea to the sort of setting up of the partnerships, because in some ways it's like traditionally in development, you want to like plan everything exactly in advance, right? And then just execute it. But that's kind of not the way this works, right? And really, that's also kind of not the way the world works. Like the small businesses that flourish in my neighborhood, or the way a lot of farmers around me have found pathways to earn extra income through attending farmers markets, and they're very local examples for me here in Australia, but they're not because someone engineered that. They're because it built over time through people who were entrepreneurial, sharing with each other. And so that's where I think of the supporting systems, not just as like, how do we get investors in, but the supporting systems might actually be about, capacity building in entrepreneurial skills, or, right? It's about the enablers of how those kind of business systems arise naturally in our worlds. And recognizing those enablers and dialing them up, I think, rather than always trying to kind of exactly set who is going to work with who and then making sure that they've got an agreement. I think that's how we're thinking of it at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we need a little bit further discussion, but let's open the floor, Nisha.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Thanks, Michiko, and thanks, Veronica. Maybe, Veronica, I'm going to take moderator's privilege here and ask you a question. So one of the things that struck me as you were sort of presenting this is that there's obviously time is needed to build some of these systems, right? In terms of not just the community engagement, the scaling deep aspect of it, but obviously it takes time to scale out while trying to scale up at the same time and vice versa. So from your experience, at least in Solomon Islands and Kiribati, what has been that timeline? And I think to Michiko's point, someone actually invests in the governance aspect, which, I mean, you might not think about governance in context of agriculture or forestry or fisheries, but there is a governance aspect, right? Absolutely. And that's what you're trying to show. And you can actually have impact on this, which is very important for that concept of locally led adaptation and scaling up of that. But yeah, who invests in that kind of governance system, I guess, is the other question, which I think we're trying to get to here. And Vicky, I'll come to your question next, but sorry, if I can throw that in there in the mix.
Okay, so we've got timelines and who invests in governance.
Yes.
The timelines thing worries me, right? I've got a colleague who works very solidly in partnership spaces, and he says, in partnerships, you can only move as fast as trust. And that's true, but we need to move faster. And so I think we're constantly sort of caught in that. ACIAR, with our traditional investments, it'll typically be 10 to 15 years of research and trial with the scaling deep and scaling out before you're getting to the point where something might like really be adopted and taken up without your support. And it could easily be 15 years or more. I think we need to find ways to shorten that cycle. And I think our thinking about sort of doing a bit more everything everywhere all at once is part of trying to shorten that cycle. And also trying to really focus on embedding capacities institutionally, rather than focusing so much on trying to achieve quite a specific on-ground result. Because if you've planned that on-ground result at the start, in 15 years, it might need to be quite different. And the good thing working with farmers is that they are often actually quite flexible and quite adaptive in their way of thinking because they've had to be. So you can get quite a bit of change happening in that time period. So if you're building the sort of capacity for those decisions to happen with climate change in mind, then you might be doing good even if you can't see that a thing has scaled out everywhere. So that was a kind of long answer to the timelines. And then who invests, like who pays for the governance, who invests in the governance? And I would say in a lot of the places that we work, actually the people themselves do. So in my Bangladesh example, which you guys will see a bit more when you get the slides, these water management groups have been set up to manage the sluice gates and whatnot, with mixed success. But there aren't that many resources required to sustain those water management groups. And many of them have stayed together even when development funding that built them has finished. And so we're looking at, what's a more kind of social enterprise or collective business model that they could use that's just a small extra little business, but it gives them enough of those resources to sustain that kind of governance structure. And so I think some of those kind of small scale, but very distributed, kind of ways of bringing in just that little bit of finance for governance could be successful. But again, it needs to be really contextualized in the local political economy. So there'll only be some places where that works.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I think actually, Vicky, I'm gonna see if you can come in to actually ask your question as well, because I think it's actually trying to get to the crux of what Michiko and Veronica were just saying. So Vicky, please do come in.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. So I think I have to read my question again. I can't remember. Oh gosh, where did I put it? So anyway, okay, so my question was, so I mean, I appreciate, thank you for the presentation. I appreciate, summing it up into 3 words: deep, out, and up. I think, those are the key words. And also it's important to have locally led adaptation, approaches to ensure that the poor and vulnerable are really, that their resilience is enhanced. And I think it's important that these are part of larger ADB investment projects, but we know it's difficult to do that. So how, what are your ideas in terms of bringing it in, integrating it into the larger ADB investments, and within, this cycle, where would be the ideal step to incorporate or to include them in the discussion? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. So to some extent, I'll answer it partly, and then I might throw the same question back at you, right? Because one of the really important things for everyone to understand is the sort of institutional constraints and rules that all different funders actually have. So as much as I might see the opportunity to do something, doesn't mean you can seize it. So, to me, you've got a situation right now where you have a sort of proliferation of these kind of case study approaches, because that's the scale at which people who have the ability to do that with some depth can get funding. So if there's a willingness to partner with, research organizations that, might be trialing something that you have no idea whether it's actually going to work or not, but doing that in a way that isn't just, we're going to invest in this and this and this, but doing it programmatically and say, we're going to learn which of these kind of scale deep processes really work and in what contexts. That would be awesome. That might not be something that you can do. You might need to kind of let those sort of seeds develop, but then you have to have a way to recognize which ones are worth investing in. And that might be then about supporting the organizations that can do the scaling out. So, and that doesn't necessarily need to be like, that could be the way you do things you're doing. That probably didn't make any sense. So, so for example, if you, had for some reason that you were going to invest in coastal green infrastructure in Pacific Island countries, right? Then actually you might be able to take the processes developed in Waimairi Future Kaikai for working with communities, and you might be able to then work with local partners to run those processes across lots of communities, but with a particular kind of lens around, well, we're going to be doing this kind of coastal green infrastructure. How are you going to take advantage of the ecosystem services that provides to build livelihoods around that? And so there could be a part of your investment that's kind of more traditional, and then a part that says, we're gonna be a scaling agent here. We're going to be an outscaling agent linked to our more traditional investment. Or similarly, you could embrace the systems change side of things. you know, traditional kind of donors, funders, multilateral banks, you guys have a lot of influence on how people think. And so being able to be part of one of those local but systems scale demonstrations could actually have a lot of influence and value. But whether that ends up being too small scale for you to justify using your funds is a question. So that's why I said I'll throw back at you a little bit. What do you think from that sort of ecosystem of scaling deep, scaling out, scaling up? What do you think you're actually allowed to do?
Vicky, did you want to come back in on that? I think
Yes, no, yeah, no, thank you for that response. I think you've you've pretty much summarized it, and and I agree to your question of what can ADB actually do, because ADB normally does big things, so I think we need to think about how we can better engage with smaller organizations to be able to do things like these and bring it up to scale. Yeah, thank you.
maybe if I could just add to that, maybe from the CRPP perspective, being housed at ADB, this is exactly, I think, what we try to do in all of our work, right? Which is, what is the space for meaningful participation in some of these systems level, government systems level thinking, whether that be on social protection and how you might actually have some access through social protection systems that are such that there is money that actually reaches the ground, that communities can use, whether that is in the type of work that Michiko was talking about, where part of the discussion between ADB and some of the communities we work with is what are the priorities you might want to see invested, and then obviously then for a government to actually take it on, because it is not necessarily our financing, it is the government's financing, right, which is a different conversation. But I think this is exactly where, and the kind of discussion where CRPP is centered on. Before I go on, I really wanted to bring Mafusa in, and then I see that Tran also has a hand up. So we have about 6 minutes left. So Mafusa, if you can come in very quickly with your question, we'll try to take these 2 more before we close. So let me go ahead. Come in, Mafusa. Okay, if not, I will just maybe ask the question for them. So,
so much for your nice
Yeah.
presentation. Yes, I have learned many things from your presentation. I just want to know that how do you manage conflict or differing interest within local communities regarding these adaptation strategies in Indonesia or Philippines? How did you manage?
Thank you for the question. I have probably 2 answers, and one is to say that one of the things that I think is still pretty true, a lot of people don't believe it, but I think it's really pretty true, is if you really carefully structure this conversation from the very beginning, right? Where it's really quite open, but it's like, okay, we're really going to take the time to understand not just what our worries and concerns are right now, but we're really going to try to understand this trajectory of climate change and what it really means for us, and how it challenges the things that we really at our core value. Then what tends to happen is a lot of perceived and somewhat superficial conflict actually kind of goes away, because it's actually based on holding things kind of tight the way they are right now. And as soon as you realize actually you have very little control over these futures coming at you, what do you really value holding on to? A lot of people value the same things. So that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is, of course, people still compete for limited resources, right? So it's not like you eliminate conflict. I'm just saying you tend to kind of dampen it a little bit when run the conversation in a very, very structured way. And then again, you're back to political economy. So, so in the polder situation in Bangladesh, one of the reasons why some people experience very different localized climate impacts compared to others is that some people end up living next to a sluice gate that someone has, paid off a government official to be able to kind of control, or they just sneak out in the middle of the night and control it anyway, because they've decided they want to open it up and let salt water in and run some aquaculture operation. But then that salt water impacts upon your crops. And so there are very real interpersonal conflicts that way. But what a lot of people don't know is sometimes the neighbors in the polder just across the way have actually, kind of educated themselves about what pathways they have to fight back against that with local government. And doing that collectively is really powerful, because if it's just one individual against another individual, then it's about the power that each of those have. But if people can gather more collectively, and there'll be many people affected by that person, illegally operating the sluice gate. So it's a very specific kind of situation there that I'm talking about, but that's what I mean about understanding political economy and then actually exploring with people the ways to navigate those situations of conflict. And so in our Polders project, that navigating your local political economy is actually part of their adaptation strategies that we're getting them to, think about what they want to trial.
Thanks so much, Veronica. And in the last 2 to 3 minutes that we have, please do come in, Tran. I'm unmuting you as well, so thanks.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Yes, my name is Quinn from Health Age, and thank you for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. Health Age has been working in Asia for the last 35 years, and we always have challenge because most of our project is pilots. We never managed to scale up, and that's always been a problem. And most of the donor doesn't only only interested in piloting, but not interested in scaling up. So that's always been our challenge. And for the last 20 years, we have been pushing ourselves to scale up our pilots. We have thousands of pilots, but we've never not managed to scale up. And so we have transformed, and we've taken the smartphone model. With the smartphone model, you see that young people likes it, older people likes it, women, men, everybody wants it. And so we developed this smartphone model where you have thousands of products that people can select. They can go through it and select what they want, they need, and can afford. And so now it has expanded quite rapidly. In Thailand, we have 30,000 groups with 4 million members, like that. And in Vietnam, we have 100,000 groups with 15 million members. So we have a number of countries now, more than 10 countries now in Asia that have this national scale up in a large number of countries. And our success have been looking at the needs of the people. I just want to share. That's it. You just want to share.
Oh, yeah, thank you. That's great to share, Quinn, actually. And, in agriculture, there's plenty of talk of these digital climate services, right? So thinking about how digital technologies can help with this scaling out type issue. And I think there's still lots of work to be done to figure out how you support the decision making in them, rather than just the information generation. And as you say, like, kind of what you're doing is there's a suite of products that people can access. And it's often not quite the same in agriculture. So we need to think through, what is it that the digital services can offer that actually helps the decision making, that provides access to the supporting services, not just kind of technical climate information, which is sort of where they've all started. And I think that's a really interesting area of evolution in terms of digital agriculture, climate services that we should be keeping an eye on. So you've reminded me of that, which is really good. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joaquin and Veronica. So I think we're actually over time, so I'm really sorry, Yung-Jung, that we're not able to take your question, but if you can type into the chat, maybe we can always email you a response as well. I just really wanted to give a huge round of applause virtually as well as in person to Veronica. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us your experience through ACIAR's work in Bangladesh as well as in Solomon Islands and Kiribati. I think you've given us a lot to think about, both from a conceptual perspective, but also from a practical perspective of how you might embed this within the way of, within the things that, say, ADB does or what other partners do. And also thank you very much to Michiko for bringing, I think, the part of the practical sort of thinking of the type of incentives that we have to think about when we work with our sort of clients per se, right, which are actually predominantly governments, in trying to take up some of the thinking behind local-led adaptation, the decision-making processes, and really what the crux of what CRPP tries to do as well. So thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll be sending around the slides as well as a survey that we hope that you take a few minutes to fill out. It would be really helpful for us as we plan future CRPP talks. Again, thanks so much, Veronica, and thanks everyone for joining us today. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you, guys. Really appreciated it. And yeah, please feel free to reach out for more conversation if you'd like.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.